I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to reading Machiavelli's Prince. Today we're looking at chapter 7, which is basically princes by fortune. If last chapter we looked at princes who are princes of new princes by virtue of their virtue and their own arms, today we're looking at the princes who are going to be new principates by fortune. Okay, or the arms of others. Okay, of principates of new principates, which are by the arms of others and fortune are acquired. So by the question, they're acquired by the arms of others or by fortune. To those who are private men and become princes only by fortune, do so with little toil, but with much toil they maintain themselves. And they do not have any difficulties on the way because they fly there. But all the difficulties arise after they are placed. In other words, okay, stop. First sentence. So if you're a prince by fortune, no difficulty to get it. No toil. It's you flow there. You fortune put you there. But all the difficulties now once you're prince. All the difficulties begin there. After you're placed. And you have to keep it. And of such kind are those who are given estate, either because of money or because of the grace of him who gives it, as happened to many in Greece and in the cities of Adonia and the Hellespont, where princes were made by Darius, so that they might keep it, the state, for its security, for his security and glory. And as was done again by those emperors from private stations attained to the imperium by the corruptions of their soldiers. So let's go look into this. What is this? So Darius the king, the great Darius the first, put a lot of people's kings, made them kings or tyrants of cities, princes of cities, kings or tyrants of cities, rulers, in order to, particularly on the Hellespont and Ionia, in order to keep them loyal, keep those places secure for what? For Darius and his empire. And as long as he made them and unmade them in that sense. They're fortune. They're by the arms. They were done by the arms of Darius. Okay, and then the same thing was happened with the emperors. So the emperors who, from private armies, from private stations, attained it by the soldiers. Right. This is what something modest. Chapter 9. 19. Chapter 19. We'll talk about this, about the later emperors who get power because of the soldiers. And Montesquieu's greatness of Romans is chapter 16. Okay, so that's what he does here. That's this paragraph. So therefore, this is that introduction. These stand simply on the will and the fortune of him who has granted it to them. But these two things are the most volatile and unstable. They do not and cannot keep that station. In other words, okay, the will and the fortune of him who granted it. In other words, you're dependent on others. You got there because someone gave it to you. Okay, they had the ability to give it to you. Their whim can change, or they have other concerns, and you don't have and they don't want to give you your equipment. If you're relying on others completely, you're dependent upon their goodwill. This is why I don't really understand Zelensky. Sometimes he hectors. Zelensky in Ukraine, who's very much dependent on Not necessarily the warfare, but this is the means to fight his war. Okay, the means to fight his war is dependent on others, and he tends not to be gracious. He tends to be saying, going about it in a later way. He tends to, So I mean, you can look at that in a certain way. Um, they cannot keep decision. They do not, because unless a man is of great intelligence and virtue, in other words, he needs to be of great intelligence and virtue, it is not reasonable to expect that he should know how to command. In other words, unless a man is of this, it should not be unreasonable that he should know how to command. Having always lived the private fortune, they cannot, because they do not have the forces which could be faithful and friendly to them. Because they're private, in other words, they live the private fortune. In other words, you can be, it's very difficult. Why? It's difficult to keep that station. Why? Why? Because unless a man is of great intelligence and virtue, in that sense, it is not reasonable that they know how to command. It is not reasonable. It is not reasonable to expect that they should know how to command. So if you don't have the mind and the virtue, it's not reasonable that you know how to command correctly. And the fact that you've lived a private virtue, your private life of fortune, this life of fortune and luck, they cannot, because they don't have the resources, the forces which could be faithful and friendly to them. They don't have the means. Moreover, states that immediately come to one immediately come to one, like all of the other things that of nature that are born and grow quickly, cannot establish their roots with all the corresponding branches. In other words, you come to one quickly. It's like something that's born quickly, born and grows quickly. The problem with those things that are born quickly, their roots don't go deep with the branches. They don't have with all the corresponding their roots with all their corresponding to get firmly in there. In such a mode, the first adverse weather extinguishes them, right? If they don't have the deep, if it grows great high, but then the bad weather, everything is pulled out, because their roots are not deeply and firm in there. They're not rooted, unless they have, in other words, unless, as has been said, those who suddenly become princes are already of such, of already of a virtue equal to which fortune has thrown in their laps, and they know immediately how to prepare themselves to preserve it. And those foundations which others have made before they become prince, they afterward make. In other words, okay, I'm lucky. Other princes who princes, they made these things before. They made these foundations previously before coming in. I'm just now in charge. Now I have to make them now. Words, I have to have the good sense. I have to have the virtue and the knowledge to know how to prepare, to now immediately make up for what should have been done earlier. So therefore, what is that? In other words, equal to which fortune has thrown in their laps. You have to have, in other words, they have to have a virtue equal to the fortune, and they know how to immediately prepare what others have already prepared. See, that's how he ends there. I wish, with regard to these two, I wish, with regard to these two said modes of becoming a prince, either by virtue or by fortune, to allude two examples within living memory, that of Francesco Sforza and Cesare Borgia. So there's two examples. Sforza, Milan, and Borgia will become that of this. Francesco, by proper means, by proper means and with his own great virtue, became Duke of Milan from a private station. In other words, he was the mercenary captain who becomes captain of the thing and gets prince. And that which he had with 1,000 pains acquired, he with little toil maintained. So he, in other words, he did it through virtue, right? He did it by virtue. In other words, he got lucky by the occasion. He is kind of like through virtue. And therefore, which by 1,000 pains he acquired, he with little toil maintained. On the other hand, Cesare Borgia, whom the vulgar called Duke Valentino, acquired the state with his father's fortune. In other words, Pope Alexander Alexander VI gives him the position, gives him the title. And with the same, he lost it. In other words, once his father was no longer Pope and the new Pope came in, he lost his principate. Okay? So in other words, it's notwithstanding that he used every means and that he did all those things which ought to be done by a prudent and virtuous man to establish his roots in those states that the arms and fortunes of others have granted him. In other words, he did everything, he does everything right, and he still fails. He had in other words, his virtue. In other words, his example here is that it was given to him by his father, and once his father was no longer the Pope was a new Pope, he lost it because of that, right? And even though he did everything his means, his virtue. In other words, he did it and he was done by the prudent and virtuous man to establish roots in those states through the arms and fortunes of others granted to him. So he was depending upon others' arms. For he who does not first make his foundations, as was said above, might yet be able to make them afterwards by means of a very great virtue. In other words, even if you don't do it before, right, foundations prior, you can, in other words, you can make them afterwards, but it takes great virtue to do this, right? Although it might have to be done with hardship to the architect and danger to the edifice. In other words, if you don't prepare ahead and you're doing it afterwards, it might threaten endanger the structure you're creating, and it's danger to the man who does it. Okay. If then one considers all the Duke's progresses, he will see that he had made for himself a great foundation for future power. In other words, the Duke made what Duke he's talking about is that I think he's talking about Borgia. Borgia made a great foundation for future progress. He had a super virtue. In other words, his virtue, he had great virtue. He used, I judge these not superfluous to discuss, because I do not know with what better precepts there could be for me to give to a new prince than the example of his actions. So, in other words, his actions. But again, I think there's a problem here. The Duke is. We have to answer the question. We're assuming he's talking about Borgia, right? But is he? Is he maybe? Okay. Most commentators will say Borgia, but there's two dukes. There's the Duke of Milan and Borgia. So he doesn't mention Borgia. He said that the Duke of After, but he implies it, right? If one considered, in other words, it's implied from the previous sentence about not having prepared everything in the beginning and having this virtue. But in many sense, did Sej, in other words, he created something new too, but he had an army. In other words, Milan had his virtue already, right? His great virtue. And the difference is, so Cesare Borgia is supposed to be an example of someone who conquers. One is more fortune than virtue, right? Milan is by virtue. Duke of Milan is Sforza is by virtue of his ability, but luck of this. But then the Duke has virtue also. What is this? It's an example of virtue is not enough, right? I judge these not superfluous to discuss, because I do not know what better precepts there could be for me to give to a new prince than the example of his actions, Caesar. And if these orders of his did not profit him, it was not his fault, because this failure to profit arose from an extreme malignity of fortune. In other words, fortune. In other words, like himself, Machiavelli said had suffered from malignity of fortune, but Cesare is another person who suffers from in other words, he didn't profit from it because what? An extreme, an extraordinary and extreme malignity of fortune. Okay, let's continue. Okay, I'm going to have to go back. Alexander had many difficulties, present and future, in wishing to make the Duke his son great. This is note 5, chapter 3. Like you talk about chapter 3, see chapter 3, right? In other words, he's not hereditary. First, he saw no way whereby he might be able to make him a lord of any state except that which was already a state of the church. So therefore, he couldn't, he just gave him. In other words, he couldn't make him head of a state which the church didn't already possess. And if he wished to take that which belonged to the church, he knew that the Duke of Milan and the Venetians would never consent to it, because Frezza and Rimini were already under the protection of the Venetians, right? So in other words, if he gave something to that, if he gave something of the church to his son, Cesare, the Duke of Milan and Venetians would never agree, because they're protecting other actors in the papal lands, papal states. Because he saw that the arms of Italy, and particularly those which could have served him, were in the hands of those who had cause to fear the greatness of the Pope, right? Um, uh, uh, and therefore he could not trust them. All of these arms were in the hands of the Orsini and the Colanas, Colanas and their followers. Now, these are the great two mercenary camps. These are the two camps of the mercenaries, the Orsini and the Colanas. Now, this is note 7. The Orsini and Colanas are two great families of Roman nobilities, had struggled with each other for 2 centuries for control of Rome and the papacy. The Orsini had been the enemies of the Borgia from the beginning, in a war against them waged Alexander, right? So that the Orsini and the Colini are the two families that opposed this in Rome against the Borgias in that sense. So, okay, that all this, and they had allies in either Milan or Venice, right? The Venetians. It was necessary then that he upset these orders, and that he put into disorder the states of all of these, so that he might in security become lord of part of them. So he needed to unstable all of these things in order to become lord of this one. He had to unstable not only the Orsini and the Corlines, uh, but in order to become this, that they were going to oppose this. If he took anything here, these forces would oppose it, but then their supporters in Venice and Milan would support them, right? Um, so, in other words, he upset these orders, disorder of the states, so that he states of all of these, so he might in security become the lord of part of them. So he wanted to create disorder and therefore get a part of them. In other words, disorder them and therefore get a part of them, right? So it was necessary then that he upset these orders, right? This was easy, for he found that the Venetians, moved by other courses, had decided to let the French enter into Italy again. Okay, right? We talked about that, right? The Venetians let the French into. We talked about that in chapter 3, right? the example of Louis, right, coming back in, and the Venetians, what he did. Which entrance not only entrance he not no, sorry, which entrance he not only did not oppose, but made most easy by resolving the question of King Louis's previous marriage. Again, this is not only him, but Cesare through the help of his father, right? In other words, I remember Cesare at first was a bishop. He was a cardinal, a bishop and a cardinal, and therefore then he became a duke, right? Uh, because of this, and that he helped the question. He helped Louis with the dissolving of the marriage. The Borgia, the king, Pope does, right? The king then passed into Italy with the aid of the Venetians and the consent of Alexander. And he was no sooner in Milan than the Pope had troops from him for the enterprise in Romagna, right? The French gave him troops for the Romagna campaign, which was granted to him because of the reputation of the king. The king, in that sense, this is a the reference here is the enterprise of Romagna, and not to the troops, right? Thus, the meaning is that Alexander and Cesare were permitted to enter the Romagna because of not of their own virtue, but because of the virtue of France. Okay, they enter into France, get the Cesare and the Alexander get Romagna because of the reputation of the king. The Duke acquired then the Romagna, and with the Colonnades beaten down, he wanted to keep that. He wanted to keep that acquisition and proceeded again further. Two things impeded him: one, his arms, which did not seem faithful to him; the other, the will of France. That is to say, that the Orsini arms, which he was using, might fail him, and might not only impede his acquiring more, but might take away his acquisition. And that the king might also do the same. So, therefore, in other words, his own arms are not his, they're the Orsini arms. And the king of France and his arms might do in other words, he's relying on the Orsinis to be his arms, or that he beat the yes with the Orsinis and the French, he beat up the Colonnades, right? He Nas, Colonnades, I can't remember to pronounce it right. He then does what? He does okay. The king might do the same. Both of these might betray him, and he might do something, but then they'll take it away from him, right? His suspicion of the Orsini were verified when, after the conquest of Veneza, he assaulted Bologna, and there he saw them go coldly into the assault. And of the king he knew his mind when, having taken the duchy of Umbino, he assaulted Tuscany, from whence the enterprise of the king made him desist. In other words, the king said, "No, you have to stop." So 9 is he refers to the duke. But in other words, he had to stop. Whereupon the Duke resolved to depend no longer on the arms and fortune. So after the king, in other words, first he saw at the assault on Bologna, right? After the conquest of Firenze, and as he assaulted Bologna, he saw that his Orsini arms were not all that willing, and that when he went on to after taking when he assaulted Tuscany, the king stopped him. The king of France stopped him from this. So the Duke, whereupon the Duke at this point, Cesare, does resolve to depend no longer on the arms and fortune of others. First, he weakened the Orsini and Corleone factions in Rome. So he basically knocked out their mercenaries and weakened their factions. For he gained all their adherents who were of the Roman nobility by making them his gentlemen and paying them large allowances. So in other words, all their retinue, all the retinue of the Orsinis and the Corsina. He bought them. He made them his men and paid them large allowances. And he honored them by according to their qualities, with their commands and ministries, and in such a mode that in a few months their affections for their factions were quite extinguished in their minds, and all were turned to the Duke. In other words, first of all in other words, he made it sure that their loyalties now were his loyalties, because he made it so he integrated them so firmly in his enterprise by their virtues and their qualities. In other words, he brought them to a great degree, but then showed them they had more to gain with him and made it clear to them and put their interest inside firmly within their things. After this, he waited for the occasion to extinguish the chieftains of the Orsini, having already dispersed the house of Colonos. A good one came to him, and he used it. He used it even better. In other words, he already dispersed the house of Colonos. Now the chieftains of the Orsini. He waited for an occasion to do this. A good one came to him, and he used it even better than the other one. For the Orsini, perceiving too late that the Duke's greatness and that of the church was their ruin, called the Diet of Megigoni in Perguta, Pergusia. This is a footnote again. The council met. This council of war met October 9, 19, to seek means to stop Borgia. Right? They met there to meet those attending. There's a note of all those who attended. Right? They met there a diet. They met a diet. All the people to oppose Borgia. Whence arose the rebellion of Urbano and the tumults of the Romalia, and infinite dangers for the Duke, all of which he overcame with the aid of the French. So in other words, he then used the French to crush the Orsini. And having regained his reputation, trusting neither in the French nor or any other outside forces, so that he needed not test them, he turned to deception. So therefore, in other words, he did not rely on that. He turned to deceptions, and he knew so. In other words, and he knew so well how to dissimulate his mind, that the Orsinis themselves, through Signor Polo, were reconciled to him. In other words, through deceptions, and he knew how. In other words, it's a wonderful thing, and he knew so well how to dissimulate his mind, give his mind out, that the Orsinis themselves, through Signor Polo, were reconciled to him. The Duke forgot not one reason or duty of office in attempting to assure Signor Paolo, giving him money, clothes, horses, such that their simplicity conducted them to Sinigalia, and them to Sinigala in his hands. In other words, this is a very interesting footnote. These concordi were called into a meeting with Cesare, in other words, at that place, on December 31st, 52, where were arrested by him. Verelli and Ursino were strangled the next morning. The Orsini were subject to arrest in Rome, and the siege of the Orsini strongholds in Capella, Serai, and Bacrena followed. Machiavelli narrated these events in a description of the method used by the Duke of Brentano in killing those, and his chief works. In other words, is the famous letter about this. He talks about that, about how to handle this. So therefore, this is interesting. He says, he handed them into his hands. Literally, they strangled the Orsini leaders. Having thus extinguished these chieftains and reduced their partisans into friends, the Duke sufficiently had a range of good foundations for his power. And having all the Romagna with the Duchy of Urbano, in this Duchy of Urbano, but Principally, he appeared to have acquired the friendship of the Ramaya, gaining to himself all its people as they began to taste the good that was to be theirs. In other words, not only did he achieve the order through the controlling of these powerful interests, he gained the loyalty of the people. How? Because what they began to taste the good that his rule, what he did here, benefited. He says they began to taste the good. This is the problem. The people they haven't tasted, they haven't experienced it. They taste it, they experience it, and they become now loyal, right? Because it's going to be theirs. Now, this latter thing is, and because this part is worthy of notice and imitation by others, I do not want to omit it. So now he's giving an example that this is something that other people should pay attention to. The Duke, having taken the Ramaya, found it commanded by impotent lords, who had been quicker to despoil their subjects than to correct them. In other words, the lords were impotent and they would despoil, steal from their subjects, then try to force them. They were impotent; they couldn't force them to do anything. And who gave them matters of disunion, not union. In other words, they kept power by dividing them and causing chaos and not having anyone to oppose them, setting them against each other, and therefore this. As the province was filled with robberies and of factional quarrels, and every other reason for arrogance, he judged it necessary, wishing to reduce that province to peace and obedience under the princely arm, to give them good government. So it was a shit show, you can say, that the previous lords were impotent, didn't have enough power. Because of their lack of power, they didn't correct the people. And because of that, they ruled them by dividing them and keeping everything in chaos. And they would rather just they robbed their cities and despoiled them. That's what despoil means. It robbed them rather than correct the people. Now, so therefore, he needed, and they were full because of their robberies, their partisanship, their factions, and everything. Now he needed to reduce them to peace and obedience under Prince Leon, and therefore to give them good government. So what does he do? So that he placed there Messer Mirko Diorco, a cruel and expeditious man, to whom he gave the fullest of power. So he appointed Messer Diorco, or Meso Diorco, a cruel and expedition. I mean, he's cruel, but he's going to get things done quick. In other words, not. He's going to get things done, run things through, not take it gently, just expeditious, right? Cruel and expeditious man, who he gave the fullest of power. So he had all the power. That man, in little time, and with great reputation, reduced the Ramaya, to peace and unity. He used force, he used ruthless force to exterminate the factions, to exterminate the criminality, to put order. And everyone knew it and was afraid of him, right? The Duke then judged that such excessive authority was not necessary, because he did not doubt that it would arouse hatred. In other words, people, because of the force and violence and the ruthlessness, there was hatred. People started, enough of the cities, they feared him, but they also hated him, right? Marco, because could produce hatred. He says it was excessive. Excessive authority was not necessary, and because he did not doubt that it would arouse hatred. And he set up a civil judiciary in which every city had its own advocate in the midst of that province, which had a most excellent presence. So he establishes a legal, in other words, civil judiciary, put judges who were good, in other words, excellent judges, who are going to be in this every province. There's going to be an advocate, and that's going to have someone who's going to presiding over the judiciary well. And because he knew that the past severities has generated some hatred, in order to purge the minds of the people and to gain them all to himself, He wished to show that if any cruelty had been done, it had not come from him, but from the harsh nature of his minister. So he gave an example. He made an example. But in other words, it wasn't from him. It was his minister who did it. It was not my fault. This is a lesson people should learn. If you're going to do brutal things, have someone else do it. If you're going to have to do dirty work, don't do the dirty work yourself. Do it by others. Then you can do what he does here. What? And he found the occasion to make them happy, to come to him, right? To resolve them. He had him placed one morning in the piazza in Caesarea in two pieces, with a piece of wood and a bloody knife alongside. Now, Alvarez's note, Romario d'Arco, right? The mode of execution, as Machiavelli says, was meant to satisfy and stupefy the people. It's a rare example of which it will be said, in other words, a rare example of which much will be said. The bloody knife and the piece of wood adds a touch of mystery, which makes and evokes wonder. Right? The imagery of the bloody knife and the wood alongside. In other words, the ferocity of the spectacle left the people at the same time satisfied. They were happy that the guy they hate was gone, but they were stupefied because it's how did it happen? And my God, how the body in half with the stick, bloody stick and bloody knife. It's mystery in that sense. Therefore, the wonder, the spectacle, the ferocity of the spectacle left the people both stupefied and stupefied. Awe. But let us return to where I left off. So he gives the example. He gave this long example about how he accomplished the means he accomplished the winning of the Romagna to him. I say the Duke, finding himself powerful enough, in part secured against the present dangers, being armed with his own mode, and having in part a good part extinguished those arms which, because near, could harm him, wishing to proceed with acquisition, there remained the King of France for his consideration. So he got this order. Now he has to deal with France. For he knew that the king, who was late to realize his error, would not support him. So in other words, the king did not realize his mistake by doing what he did to eliminate the Romagna, centralize it like this. He would not support him on his next endeavor. Because of this, he began to look for new friends, and he temporized. With France with respect to the French expedition to the Kingdom of Naples against the Spanish, who were then besieging Gaeta. And he had, in other words, he temporized the situation. The French were at expedition in Naples against the Spanish, who then were besieging Gaeta. And then he, of a mind to assure himself of them, he would quickly have succeeded in doing so had Alexander lived. In other words, had Alexander lived, he would have, in other words, succeeded. Because what does he do? He goes to the French and the Spanish and tries to get them to assure themselves of this. So therefore, Alexander's death. If Alexander lived a little longer, maybe he would have succeeded. In other words, the death of his father dealt it in. And this is how he managed the present things. And this was how he managed the present thing, period. And that's a new paragraph, one sentence paragraph. But as to the future, he had to doubt, first of all, whether a new successor to the church would be friendly to him. And therefore, that he might seek to take away that which Alexander had given to him. He thought of securing himself in four modes. First, by extinguishing the blood of all those lords whom he had to dispose, in order to take that opportunity away from the Pope. Right? So he extinguished those things. Secondly, by gaining to himself or the gentlemen of Rome, as had been said, to hold the Pope in check. So the gentlemen, all the families in Rome and all the things like this, now check the Pope. Thirdly, to reduce the College of Cardinals to his power. In other words, get the College of Cardinals on his side. And fourth, to acquire such an imperium before the Pope's death that he could resist the first attack of his enemies. Of these four things, at the death of Alexander, he conducted the three. The fourth, he almost conducted. The fourth, he had almost under his conduct. Now, 13. This is, in other words, contrary. In other words, under his conduct, he conduct. In other words, oh no, this is wrong. Okay. In other words, the concada is a contract with the mercenary captains. Here, almost under his conduct, is to understand he had almost brought it to a completion. In other words, he had almost brought it to a completion here. In that sense, he had almost under his conduct. He almost completed it. He almost it. This fourth thing, the fourth thing in that sense, almost was completed. Of the dispossessed lords, he had killed as many as possibly could. He and very few saved themselves. He had gained the Roman gentlemen, and of the college, he had the greatest part. And as to the new acquisition, he had planned to become the Lord of Tuscany. He had already possessed Perego, Perugia, and Cambio. He had taken the Pisa under his protection. And since he no longer needed to have respect for France, he no longer needed to do so. For the French had already disposed the kingdom of Naples by the Spanish in such a way that each of these was necessitated to compete for his friendship. In other words, France and Spain had to compete for his friendship. He would have leaped into Pisa. So in other words, both of them would have helped him to get Pisa in that sense. After this, Lucca and Siena would have quickly surrendered, partly from envy of the Florentines, partly from fear, and the Florentines would have no remedy. Had he succeeded in this, and he was in the year that Alexander died, and he was in the year that Alexander died, he would have acquired such forces, that such reputation that he had could not have stooped up by, in other words, reputation that he could have stood up by himself, and he would no longer have depended on the fortunes of others. But in other words, he was not dependent upon the fortune and forces of others, but on his own power and virtue. In other words, if he had that force and he built that things. But had Alexander died 5 years after Alexander died 5 years after he began to draw forth the sword. In other words, this is the metaphor here, the fourth. In other words, Alexander and Caesar, Alexander who draws the sword. It's Alexander who draws the sword, not Caesar. Okay, it's interesting. Alexander draws the sword, and Caesar is in means, right? So he left Caesarea with the state of Romalia alone consolidated, with all the others up in the air, between two powerful enemy armies that have, and sick unto death. That he himself was sick in that sense. And there was in the Duke such ferocity and such virtue that he knew so well how men have to be gained or lost, and so sound were the foundations that he laid in so little time that had those armies not been on his back, or that he had been healthy, he would have stood up to every difficulty. So if he had been healthy, this now notice this the examination here. Oh, if he'd been healthy, if he had not those armies on his back and he had been healthy, he could have. He was strong enough foundations. He could have resisted if these two things of fortune were not the case, right? And one can see that his foundations were well laid, for the Remalia waited for him more than a month. In Rome, though but half alive, he was safe, and although the Bagoni and Vitelli and Orsini came to Rome, none followed them against him. And if he was not able to make someone whom he wanted pope, at least it would not be someone whom he did not want. In other words, he could have. In other words, even if he couldn't make the person he wanted pope, then he could prevent someone he didn't want to become pope. Okay, he was in that ability to control who was the pope. But if he had been healthy on the death of Alexander, everything would have been easy for him. So therefore, it would have been in other words. But he could have stopped it. Even unhealthy, he still had the means to stop things. But it was a little more difficult. It would have been easier if he was healthier, right? And he told me on the day that Julius was made pope that he thought on the day Julius made pope that he had thought on all which could arise from his father's death, and and that he had found a remedy for everything, except that he never thought that when his father was at the point of death, that he would also be up close to death. Now, again, Machiavelli's 15 note. This is de Alvarez's note 15. Alexander and Caesarea both fell ill in August in 52. The two armies were on the back were the French at Rouge, the Spanish who were moving towards Rome from Naples. Caesarea did not, however, die until 1507, where he was killed in a skirmish fighting for the king of Navarre, his brother-in-law. So he doesn't die here; he dies elsewhere. Now that's important to understand that he just loses power. He loses his Italian. He loses his Italian, and Tuscany doesn't get the Tuscany. Summing up all the actions of the Duke, I would not know how to find fault with him. He says, he goes, he starts out with this idea. Well, looking at this, it looks like fortune was the problem, right? On the contrary, it seems to me he ought to be set up as I have done, to be imitated by all those who have fortune, and who by fortune and with the arms of others have exceeded the imperium. So he says maybe since I have set him up as an example by those who have. In other words, I'm saying I can't blame him, and you should imitate what he did, particularly those who come into power by arms of others and fortune. For having a great mind and high intentions, he could not govern otherwise. And only the brief life of Alexander and his own illness sorted his plans. It seems accidental, right? Whoever then judges it is necessary in his new principate to assure himself of his enemies, to gain to himself friends, to conquer either by force or by fraud, to make oneself loved and feared by the people, followed and revered by the soldiers, to extinguish those who can or must harm you. Again, 16, shift from the third person to the second person familiar. In other words, this is third person that he, to you, and familiar you, to innovate the ancient orders with new modes. In other words, to innovate the ancient orders with new modes, and to be severe and gracious, magnanimous and liberal, to extinguish the unfaithful militia and create new ones, to maintain the friendship of kings and princes in such a mode that they must benefit you graciously or offend you with respect. One can find no fresher example than the action of this man. So he praises him. This is where he gives the praise. And again, this echoes that of the praise that is given to what is talked about of Hero, because in the previous chapter of the last paragraph of how, the modes how he does this. The difference was Hero does his own virtue and arms. Here, he comes into power by fortune and by the arms of others, right? But he then still nevertheless does these things, right? But then notice, then one can accuse him only of creating Julia Pontiff, in which he made a bad choice. Well, wait a minute. If he could have stopped anyone, in other words, wait a minute. Whoa, 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 whoa. But I thought it was fortune that was the failure of him. But no, a bad decision. Wow. Maybe fortune is not as important as this. The fortune made it difficult. He would have succeeded, but if he didn't do this mistake, it would not have been disastrous. You can accuse him of creating Julius, to become Julius II, right? In which he made a bad choice. For, as has been said, being unable to make, in other words, being unable to make a pope in his own mode, he could have kept someone from being made pope, and he should never have consented to the papacy of those cardinals whom he had harmed, or whom once made pope would have cause to fear. Remember the rule: anyone who makes you great, anyone who you make great, they're going to fear you. Those who come into power, those who make you great, you have more. In other words, that famous line of the previous book. So, what about this? You should never have those who've harmed would want vengeance, and one who made pope. Who had to fear him, right? That anyone who had fear from here. So anyone who harmed and once made pope, anyone who'd cause to fear him. For men do harm either from fear or from hate. A general principle: men harm because either fear or hate. Of those whom he offered were among those whom he had offended were among San Priniero di Ficola, Conola, San Goggio, and Asinino, right? These are the Guardello di Ravenne, Pope Julius II, was the titular cardinal of the Church of San Prenino and Vicola in Rome. The others were the Cardinal Giovanni Colonnola, Raffaele Riccardo, the titular cardinal of the Church of San Giorgio, and Cardinal Arsenio Scorza. The cardinal, in other words, the cardinal of Rollin was Giorgio Ambrose, Georgius de Ambrose, right? In other words, these people were the ones he offended. All the others, once they were made pope, would have caused a fear. So these are the ones who would have hated him. These are the ones that he harmed. And because he harmed, they want vengeance. No, 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 no. And the other ones would have cause to fear him, right? Except Roland, the French cardinal, and the Spaniards. The latter because of their relationship to him, these because of their relationship to him and their obligations, and the former because of the power having conjoined with him with the kingdom of France, right? In other words, Roland is tied with the kingdom of France. Therefore, the Duke, before everything else, ought to have created a Spaniard as pope. And not being able to do so, he ought to have consented to Roland being made pope, not San Pedro ad Vincola, Julius, right? Because why? Well, in this one, that's when somebody's harmed. And whoever believes that great personages are made to forget old injuries by new benefits deceive themselves. In other words, this I believe that I've helped you. You forget. In other words, I'll forget old injuries because I've given you new benefits. No, no, no. You deceive yourself. He ends this great line that whoever believes that great people can be made to forget the bad things by giving them things. No, 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 no. The Duke erred then in this election, and this was the cause of his. So, in other words, the Machiavelli then undermines the earlier at the very end, in the example of this very paragraph. He sabotages the whole argument about the question of fortune. Even with the malignity of fortune, the bad luck, he could have navigated it, but he made a bad choice. Now, was the bad choice a product of his bad health? But then he should have known better. In other words, in other words, this points to an error of judgment. The crucial error was not being sick and not having the Romans and Spanish on his back, but rather making this choice. He could have made the Spanish or Roland Pope, and by doing this, he would have been, and anyone else by making Julius, by choosing San Pedro ad Vincula, who becomes Julius, loses it. This is the end. And this is how he ends this chapter. This has been a long chapter. We'll stop here. If you have any comments or questions, please put them below. Any issues you want to talk about, please put them below, and I'll respond to them when I see them. If you've liked the chapter, please, if you like what we've done in this video today, on this long discussion of the princes by fortune and arms of others, please hit the like button, hit the thumbs up. It helps the algorithm. If you have liked it again, share it, share the video, and social media and any other way you want to share it with. Share it to your friends, share it to people like this. Share it far and wide. Why? Because by liking and sharing, you help the algorithm and get more attention to this channel and these kind of videos. I know I'm kind of saying, oh, you've got noise in the background, and oh, fan, I need the air in this room, otherwise we'd suffocate. Another thing you can do is, well, if you're not subscribed, please consider subscribing. I noticed someone's unsubscribed because I haven't made some short videos. I should maybe make 1 or 2 more short videos. Well, that's it. That's the way we subscribe. Growing the channel helps the thing. We're near the magic number, and I want to get to that magic number hopefully this summer. Another thing you can do is, well, if you didn't like it, you can always thumbs down, but say why in the comment, what was wrong, and this way people can learn from it. If you want to follow me on social media, the links are below. If you want to know more about me as a scholar and as a researcher and check out my scholarship and research, you can check my link to the social media below, the academic social media below the social media. And then last but not least, if you want to help me to support what I do financially in this way, you can be a patron or a supporter through Subscribestar Patreon. The URLs are listed below, so you can link up to them and contribute. It helps. Everything a little bit helps in this sense. Another thing you can do is you can, voila, buy one of my books. Below the listed books are listed below. Available books that I have that are currently available, and then you can order it through your local bookstore. They can order things if they don't have them, or order them online seller like Amazon, Barnes and Noble, or Libra or whatever, or order it through the publisher. Okay, that's it. We'll turn next time to chapter 8, and we'll see you there. Take care. Have a great day. Bye.